Greetings. Today we're going to have a tutorial on how deflation is in fact a much worse thing than moderate inflation or even slightly high inflation, and only when inflation becomes extremely high, known as hyperinflation, is there actually a problem with inflation, and we are nowhere close to anything that could be remotely called hyperinflation in the economy today. And so this viewpoint is contrarian to the prevailing narrative out there. And the mainstream is being misled and miseducated, sometimes by people who don't know what they're talking about, or sometimes by people who do know what they're talking about but are trying to perpetuate a narrative for a pump and dump scheme. But either way, we're going to learn about the impact of deflation versus inflation on the average person's finances. So take this chart. The horizontal axis represents years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. And the vertical axis represents the monthly income or expenditures of people. So let's say you have a home on a mortgage that is $2,000 a month and the payment stays flat because it's a fixed rate mortgage. The blue line is scenario number one, where the person's annual income is rising 5% a year, and therefore they make $6,000 a month the first year, the second month is $6,300 a month, and so forth, 5% a year rising. As you can see, the mortgage payment continues to become less relative to the person's income. The mortgage payment continues to go down. And this is how a mortgage is supposed to work, and this is how people build home equity, because their payment stays the same, but the price of the home rises so that equity goes up and the mortgage shrinks as a portion of their income. And for all the horror stories about inflation in the 1970s, since a mortgaged home is really just a leveraged bet on local inflation, and that's what makes home prices go up, people who owned homes at the start of the 1970s made a ton of money by the end of the 1970s. For example, if you owned a mortgaged home in 1970, by 1982, you were quite well off. You had tons of home equity and your mortgage payment has shrunk to nothing. So inflation was actually the easiest money-making mechanism in those days because of the relatively high inflation and the very dramatic shrinkage effect it had on mortgage payments. Now, scenario number two, which the United States has not experienced at any time in the lifetimes of anyone alive today to a significant degree, is deflation. So let's say you bought the same home and the mortgage payment was $2,000 a month, again, the orange line, and the income of $6,000 a month is decreasing by 1% a year, this gray line. As you can see, the mortgage payment stays the same, but the dollars of income are becoming less and less. Therefore, the mortgage payment is increasing as a portion of the person's income. That is an extremely stressful situation to be in, and that's why deflation is far more catastrophic to anyone with debt, and especially to a society where everyone has debt, like the United States. The United States is a debt-heavy society, and therefore deflation is far, far, far more destructive than inflation, including moderately high inflation like 3% or 4% a year, which is the maximum that the United States has experienced at any point in the last 35 years. All this talk of hyperinflation, which is defined by inflation rates in double digits or even as high as 50% a year, is nowhere near on the cards, as many videos in this channel explain. Deflation is what anyone with debt should be afraid of. That's why it's so ridiculous that in the United States, the perception of high inflation is based on just really two things: the price of milk at the grocery store and the price of gasoline at the gas station. And no one seems to grasp that if they have a home on mortgage, inflation is their friend and deflation is the biggest nightmare they can imagine. They should be extremely glad that there is even some inflation, because whatever small amount of inflation exists today, 2% a year is what the average has been over the last 10 years, despite all the quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve. 2% a year is what is preventing them from disaster that would occur if deflation were to creep upon them and they have a fixed mortgage payment. So this is a very simple chart that explains how anyone with a mortgage or similar such fixed debt benefits tremendously from inflation and suffers tremendously under deflation. We're assuming, of course, that people's incomes rise with inflation. Some people's incomes rise above inflation, some people's incomes rise less than inflation, but on average their incomes do exceed inflation because there is economic growth and nominal GDP contains an inflation component. Now, the economics profession has actually misrepresented this fact to the public and comes up with a lot of very misguided and inaccurate concepts to confuse average people further, and that's why so many people, including very well-educated people, are extremely uninformed about the realities of inflation and deflation. And there are concepts like the misery index which perpetuate this misconception and spread ignorance even further, as we will soon discuss. So over here we describe something known as the misery index, and it was invented by someone known as Arthur Okun. And I don't really blame him, because maybe he just invented something that an audience of economist eggheads was desperate to consume, so he just gave them the garbage that they wanted. But the misery index is defined as the straight sum of the unemployment rate and the CPI inflation rate. Now, there's many problems with a paradigm like that. Number one, such an index implies that each point of unemployment rate increase causes the same amount of misery as each point of CPI inflation increase, and that is obviously not true. But secondly, and even worse, this is an index that rewards deflation. It actually says that all inflation is bad and all deflation is good, and that is very emphatically not true for the reasons I just explained a few minutes earlier. So to illustrate how flawed this index is, even though you're probably hearing about it now in 2021 by all sorts of people who can't get past 1970s era thinking, so they're trotting out this horrendously misguided concept again, we're going to look at the scenarios of economy number one and economy number two. Economy number one has an unemployment rate of 9%, so that's usually a severe recession that is characterized by a 9% unemployment rate. Very few times between 1946 and now have been characterized by a United States with an unemployment rate of 9%. That is a very high unemployment rate. And if the inflation rate were minus 1%, signifying deflation, you would add these two up. 9% minus 1% is a misery index of 8%. Okay? Now, economy number two has an unemployment rate of 4%. That's very low. That is usually characterized with booms. Rarely has the unemployment rate been this low, but the best economies of the United States at all times between 1946 and present have been characterized by unemployment rates of approximately this range. And if the CPI inflation rate is 4%, then you add 4 plus 4. The misery index is 8%. Now, 4% CPI inflation is a little high, but it's not really causing a huge amount of problems. Anyone with a mortgage home is piling on home equity very, very quickly and increasing their wealth very substantially. So 4% is a little above the ideal. The ideal is about 3%, but I wouldn't say that's causing much trouble. But the misery index is such a flawed and incomplete index that it gives both of these scenarios a misery index of 8%. As if both of these indices contain an equal amount of human misery. Economy number one is a much, much, much more miserable scenario than economy number two, but this index gives both of them the same number. That tells you how misguided these economist eggheads are and how theoretical they are. They have so little of a connection to average people that they create these oversimplified metrics and expect people to be impressed that they can do basic arithmetic and then act that they're really smart, that, oh, the misery index is this, the misery index is that, effectively misguiding people and miseducating people into thinking that 4% inflation is somehow worse than 1% deflation, and the unemployment rate shouldn't even matter because changes in the inflation rate can supersede it. So it's hard to even begin to describe how misguided this is, but now in the financial media and the other mainstream media, you're seeing the term of misery index being trotted out a lot. And that is very destructive because it is completely misrepresenting what is truly a robust economy versus what is a shaky economy that has a lot of human suffering. And that's a travesty. And this channel is devoted to educating people to be smarter than what the narrative is, and certainly be smarter than the garbage that the PhD economist eggheads put out. So this is certainly some food for thought. If you found this video to be educational and informative, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.